Yeah. All right. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, creatives of all ages, to the Maxon booth. I am your host, Matthias, a.k.a. Major VFX on all the platforms. You might have seen me at the 3D Motion Show, and a lot of you have given me questions about, like, hey, who's not up on the schedule? When does so-and-so present? All of that information at 3dmotionshow.com, where all of our audience from all over the world is tuning in. Hello, audience, interwebs. We miss you. Please come join us at the next one. But if you guys haven't already, go to 3dmotionshow.com, sign up. We're giving away thousands of dollars of prizes from some of our sponsors like Dell and Wacom and so many others. So definitely check it out. And we have amazing presenters, like to my left, longtime artist and presenter with us, the one, the only Bryan Coleman. Take it from here, Bryan.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, my name is Bryan Coleman. I'm a design director and style frame artist based out of Denver, Colorado. I work with After Effects, Red Giant, Redshift, Arnold, Octane, X Particles, and most importantly, Cinema 4D, which is the foundation of all of my work. A lot of my clients include Apple, MPC, Frame Store, The Mill. We are Royale Swarovski, and Man vs. Machine. I'd like to thank Maxon for bringing me out today to discuss my workflows using Cinema 4D, Redshift, and Red Giant for After Effects. My work leans towards conceptual art for most of my clients, which includes solving creative problems and guiding the art direction. You can check out my website at bryancoleman.com. On Instagram, I am Bryan the Coleman, and on Twitter, Bryan the Coleman. The work that I do has also opened a lot of opportunities in the Web3 NFT space. So you can check out my NFT projects, which I'm not going to go too deep into right now, at bryancoleman.nft.xyz. And I am on Foundation at Bryan Coleman. And I thought I would just share a little bit of my NFT work, which you can check out here. Right, so that's a bit more of my personal work, which is not my client-based work. But now I will show you my demo reel, which is a lot of client work, some personal work, style frame work, animation. So let's take a look at that. All right, thank you. Appreciate that. Let's go back to the right one. So after looking at my demo reel, so I wanted to discuss a project with you today that I worked on with the client not that long ago. So I'm going to kind of go through the brief that I got from the client. I'll show you the style frames and some of the reference, and then I'm actually going to recreate that style frame that took me maybe 4 days to make in about 1 hour. So hang on, it's going to go fast. So the brief from the client was that the world that the DNA exists in is inside of a computer. The DNA represents a level of intelligent privacy. When the DNA senses a virus inside the computer, it emits a burst of energy outwards. And then the look of the DNA will be a combination of like fiber optics with light emanating from inside. And then the look is a combination of lights, particles, and energy. And then there is like data flowing through the interior of the DNA adding visual strength and stability. So this is some of the reference that I pulled, which you can see is kind of like glass with dispersion. There's some energy bursts, maybe a little glass there, some particles, sound waves. So just a lot of light particle work that I pulled and said, I'm just like, do you like this? Is this direction that you want? And once they kind of give the okay, then that's when I start to go down the path of creating that work. So these are a few of the style frames that I created for that project. So just a few different angles. You can see that the work itself is kind of like a fiber optic piece of DNA. There are these lights inside cloners, different materials that I used, a little bit of electricity feeling, and then, of course, a variety of particles. And then this is the moment that we were actually going to be talking about today. So it's this hero moment. So you can see we have a very broad view of the DNA from the side. And then we have these bursts of energy that are coming off of the DNA. So if you remember, that's this moment that the DNA has sensed the virus inside of the system, and so now it emits this burst of energy. So again, this is all just a style frame that is designed to tell the story. So I give this to the client, and then they eventually figure out how to animate it. So I don't worry too much about that. I just make stuff look really good. So today, here's what I'm going to be discussing, which is using a cloner object and volume mesher to generate the base DNA strand. To create the interior of the DNA, I'll use spline, cylinders, and cloner objects, and then use redshift materials to give the illusion of lights and electricity. I'll quickly go over render settings for exporting those images and then take them into After Effects. I'll use RedGiant trapcode form to create additional details on the DNA and in the After Effects composition. And I'll use RedGiant plugins to create the overall look and glows. And then finally, I'll show you how to use magic bullet looks to get quick color options for style frames. So let's go ahead and jump into Cinema. So the first thing that I need to do is create a cylinder. So I will hold down Shift and hit C and type in cylinder. And I will make that orientation of the cylinder be +Z. The radius will be about 18. And then the height of that will be 2500. And then let's create a cloner object. So Shift-C, type in cloner. And then make that cylinder a child of the cloner. And I'll zoom out a little bit here so we can see what I'm doing. So for the cloner, let's leave it in grid mode. And then for the count, make that 2 in X and 1 in Z. I'll leave the default settings here for the size. So I've already set up the sides of the DNA at this point. And with that said, I'm going to call this sides. I like to label everything. Let's create another cylinder. So Shift-C, type in cylinder. And then let's make that orientation be +X, and the radius is going to be 19. So just a little bit bigger than those side strands. The height of that, we'll leave it 200. And then I'm going to zoom in here a little bit and see if I can't go back to this DNA. So you can see that I've already created the side. I'm going to create the middle, but you can see that there's sort of a pinch in the middle here for each of these, and it gives it just a little bit more of like a natural feel. So I'll show you how I do that really quickly. Go into display and quick shading lines so we can see the lines on this. Duplicate that cylinder. So I'm going to hold down Control and drag. And then let's make that just a little bit bigger than the cylinder that's underneath it. And with that selected, go to Basic and X-Ray. So now I can actually see through that geometry. So the next thing that I want to do is convert this into a polygon object. And then I'm going to use this new cylinder as a mesh deformer for that cylinder that's just a little bit smaller underneath it. So to do that, let's do Shift-C again. And I will use a mesh deformer and make that mesh deformer a child of that cylinder. And then under Object, take that cage or that mesh that we converted to a polygon and drag it down here to where it says cage, and then click Initialize. And now with that cylinder selected, go into point mode, and if I just grab one of those points, I can now drag that up and down. And you can see that it will deform anything underneath it. One thing I do want to point out, though, is that if I make any adjustments to this base cylinder, let's say increase the height segments, rotation segments, and then go back into that cylinder, with that point selected and try to move it, it doesn't work. And I was trying to figure that out for a long time until I realized that all you have to do is go back into the mesh deformer and click initialize. And now it takes into account the changes that you made. So just want to point that out in case any of you run into that while you're working on this, because it would drive me insane. Let's grab the rectangle selection and grab those group of points there in the middle. And let's just scale that down a touch. And then scale the middle down a little bit more. So we have just like a nice little pinch inside there. And let's group that together. So I'll do Alt-G on a PC, so it's now in its own group. And then let's create another cloner object. So Shift-C and type in cloner. And I will call this middle. I just like to label everything. Take that null and make it a child of the middle. Zoom out here. And then with that cloner selected, we want to leave it on grid. And then for the count of X, make that 1. For the count of Z, make that 21. And let's take the size of Z down to 121. So now we have about 21 of those middle strands in there. And it's just a little, or the DNA connectors, I guess. I'm not even really sure what you actually call those. I should have looked that up before I did this. So we have a variety of those in the middle there, so it's just a little bit smaller than our DNA. So the next thing I want to do is just, let's group these together, and I want to call this base. And now is when I start to get really meticulous about how I organize things. So I will create a new layer, so go into your Layers tab, and you can double-click here, and that will create a new layer, and I will call this base, and with Control selected, drag and drop that onto the base. So now everything in there, all the children, are part of that base group. And I can turn the visibility of that off. And when I'm rendering, I can turn that off too. So for right now, let's just turn both of those off because I don't need to see them. And let's create a volume builder. So type in volume builder. And let's create a volume mesher as well. So with that builder selected, go to the attributes and drag that base group in there. And so now that base group has been converted into voxels. So for the voxel size, take that down to 4. And then add an SDF smooth in here. So that's going to actually smooth everything out just a little bit. And then take the voxel distance of that to about 1. So the 1 is going to help retain that original sizing that we had created, but then also smooth things out and make that volume builder be a child of the mesher. And now you can see that we have that strand of DNA. Let me just turn on quick shading. And so you can see now that if I zoom in here, if you recall, I made those the middle radius of these be just a little bit bigger than the edge. And I did that so that it's a bit more organic feeling. Plus now it has that little pinch in the middle, and it's now one cohesive piece of geometry. Let's create a new layer. So I'm gonna double click the volume mesher and Control C to copy the name. This is how I work really quickly. And then create a new layer, and then hit Control V, and then Control drag and put that on its own layer. I'll change the color here because I can't really see it. So one of the reasons that I do this with layers, and you'll see everything I do is on a layer, is because I work really quickly. And if I have to make any changes down the line, I like to be able to go back to it and be able to turn things off so that everything is kind of labeled on its own. Plus, when I have to hand off projects, which I do from time to time, I can hand it off to the client and they can easily work with it versus having just like insane names, insane layers, like stuff turned on and off. So this is how I stay organized personally. Let's create a new null, and I'm going to call this build. And then make that volume mesher be a child of the build. And this is just an extra step that you don't necessarily have to take, but I am going to take. So I will have everything that I create from here on out be under this build null or group. So make the volume mesher in the layers be a child of that. So again, it's like everything that's up here in the objects looks exactly the same as it does here in the layers. It's probably a little overkill, but that is how I like to work, keep myself organized. So the next thing that I want to do is add a little bit of twist and a little bit of bend to this. So zoom out just a touch, and I will create a new twist deformer. So you could go in here to the deformers menu, but I like to work a little more quickly than that, though that's not the slow way to do it. But Shift-C, type in twist, and make that be a child of the build. Rotate that around by -90 degrees, and then go into the attributes, and under the angle, if I start to twist this around, it starts to bend that entire DNA, but it's only bending a portion of it, not the entire thing. So how you fix that is go to mode. Instead of using limited, use unlimited, and so now I have a twist over that entire length. I ended up using something around like 50 on this, and then I could even move this along that DNA and it rotates the entire thing. I think I ended up using something like that. So the next thing I want to do is just give this entire structure a little bit of curvature. So I will use a bend deformer. Once again, let's rotate this by about 90 degrees. And for the height of Y, or the size of Y, make that be about the same size as our side structure. So it's 2,500 centimeters, if you remember that. And now I will go into strength, and I will start to bend this, but you can see that we have run into a problem. It is bending it, but it is bending it in a weird way, and that is an order of operations issue. So you just want to take the twist and put that on top of the bend, and now it is bending perfectly. And then I also want to use keep length, so just check that. So now I have that base DNA structure that is right here. So now we're going to start to build some of the interior of that as well. I may as well set up a camera while I'm at it. So let's turn the visibility of these deformers off and just zoom in here to get a little bit closer to everything. Maybe just make it somewhat symmetrical, I suppose. Though you want it to feel a little natural. So with my perspective set up, I will just click the camera, and it creates a new camera in the exact place that my perspective viewport is at. So make sure that you are looking through that. So I know that I want this sort of angle, but I also know that I want to make an adjustment to the focal length. So I want to flatten the entire scene out. So I will put a focal length of 200 millimeters, which will zoom us in a little bit. And I'm not sure if you can tell the difference, but it flattens things out, which is good in this scenario because it gives you a better opportunity to see the twist throughout. If I was getting really close in here to this, I might use a much smaller focal length, and it would be a little bit more dramatic. But for this shot, let's keep it just like it is. And then I want to leave that camera exactly where it's at. So let's put a protection tag on that. So it's going to hold the position, rotation, and scale, so it's not going to move it. Though I'm seeing that I maybe want this over a little further. It's just being meticulous. Okay. So the next thing I want to do is start to create the interior of this. So I'm going to do most of the build first, and then I will start to do the materials on the inside to light this thing. So let's go ahead and create the interior. So I have my volume mesher here on this layer, so I can turn the visibility on or off if I want. Let's grab this side underneath the base, the original build that we had been doing, and let's put that in its own group. And I am going to call this, let's see, what did I even grab? Let's call this side lights. Okay. Create a new layer and call that side lights. Make that a child of this, and again, control drag and drop, and now that is on its own layer. But you see that we're having a little bit of a problem here because I do not have enough lines or adaptive points on here. So one of the ways to fix that is to click on the cylinder, and under attributes, just increase the height segment. So a number that I use is 96. I don't know why. It's just a number that feels good to me, and I always use it. It could be 100, but I don't know why it's 96. Let's take the radius down to 1. So we're going to make it really thin. And then we are going to do the exact same thing for the middle. So let's put that on its own layer, or own group, and call this middle lights. Create a new layer, call that middle lights. And make that a child. Drag and drop. Everything in there is its own layer. Grab the, what I really want to do is just grab this cylinder without any deformation on it. So let's just delete everything else that's in there. So I just have that original cylinder, and then under attributes, make that radius be 1. So now you can see that we have that internal structure, which I will then turn these into lights using materials. So the next thing I want to do is just set up, if we look really closely in here, you can see that I have these little splines in here, which the idea was sort of like electricity. So it's like, how do you convey the idea of electricity in a style frame? And so I'll show you how I set that up really quickly. So with that middle lights selected, let's control drag, and I will duplicate that. And let's call that middle splines. And a new layer, call that middle splines. And then put that on its own layer. And I will delete that cylinder that's in there. And then I want to create a straight line. So one of the easiest ways that I have sort of grown accustomed to creating a straight line is to use an inside. And so it creates a spline that has 6 sides. So I will just take that down to 2, and now I miraculously have a straight line. Make that inside, which I am going to rename electric, just because I don't want to keep saying inside. Electric sounds cooler. Make the height or the radius of that be 100. And now I have splines running the entire length of that middle area as well. So now I need to sort of create this like little deformation in there, and I'll do that with a deformer. So do Shift C and type in displacement or displacer for a displacer deformer. Make that a child of the electric, and under attributes, go to shading and click noise. So I don't know if you saw that. It moved a little bit, but not a lot. And the reason is because I need to increase the intermediate points on this. So I will choose natural, and can anybody guess the number that I might use? 96. So now if I zoom in, we have just a little bit of movement across that. And it's all fairly much the same, which maybe that doesn't matter a whole lot. To me, it kind of does in this moment. So if you use, I think it's world, it will make each of those have a little bit of a different deformation on that. And then you notice in the style frame that I actually have 3 of those running through there. Maybe you don't notice that, but I did. So I will just duplicate that. And one really quick, easy way to make a new one would just be to go into the noise, and for the seed, let's just go down to like 664. So now I have a variety of different splines in there with different deformations on there. And then I might just turn the object height displacement down to like 5, just so it's not so severe. So at this point, we have like the main structure already built. So I could keep going with this. I could show you a few other things with cloners, but I'm giving you the foundation of what to go on right now. So let's start to light this scene. I'll turn the visibility of everything back on, and then let's create. Let's grab our material manager. Let's grab that, and I like to have it be down here. Though it's always tricky with the new layout. And I even practiced this earlier so that I wouldn't make a mistake, and here I am. So let's drag that up. Okay, so let's also grab a redshift render view, and I will bring that over here. All right, so now I can see everything. So let's click play, and we will see our render pop up. All right, so I have my volume mesher that we see there. So let's go to create redshift material and view, and I'm going to do that view, drag that onto the volume mesher, double click, go into the edit shader graph, and I will grab this material node, and under preset, let's use glass. And under the reflection weight, let's take the roughness to 0.4. So you can see that when I added that material, it became very transparent. So I'm just trying to bring it back to life. So I added some roughness, which is going to give it a bit more of that fiber optic feel. The IOR, I'm going to take down to 1.25. So if I decrease that down to 1, you can see through it entirely. If I increase it much higher, you can see that it distorts everything inside. So the goal was to be able to see everything inside, but have a little distortion. So 1.25 on that is good. And then if I go into the dispersion, put that on 70, and you can see that now we've added just a little bit of color along the edge of this entire thing. So the next thing I want to do is light this, and I did not use any lights in the scene. I actually just used a plane with an emissive material on it. So let's create a new plane and make that a child of the camera, and then the orientation should be plus Z. The width should be 1920, and the height should be 1080. And then let's go into the coordinates and zero everything out except for Z. I'm sure someone out there is like, why don't you just use this function to do that? But that's how I do it. So I'll just make it about that size, create a new material, redshift material, and drag and drop that onto that plane. Double click the material tag to go into the edit shader graph. And then type in texture to create a new texture node. And then under general, I'm going to have to find my texture really quickly, which I think should be right there. So I have this back plate that I use to light it, which is also the base of my After Effects comp. So I'm using the same thing, and you'll see that in just a moment. So I'll use go to overall emission color, and then let's grab that material node, and then take the diffuse down to 0, the reflection down to 0, and then the overall emission weight, let's take that up to like 6. So now you can see that we have that material that is emissive in the background there, which is now lighting our piece of glass. So let's turn the visibility of that backplate off by hitting Shift-C. With the plane selected, let's type in redshift, and let's grab an object tag. You could also just go to tags, redshift object, and then with that tag selected, go to visibility, override, and turn off the primary ray visibility. Turn all these off as well because I don't really need it to cast shadows or anything. So just trying to limit the amount of work that the renderer has to do, because if that stuff isn't used, then why even have it in there? So you can see now that my material, or my plane back there, is lighting this entire structure. So we have some nice oranges and greens and blues and purples. You could increase the scale of this just to get a little bit of difference in there, but I'm just going to leave it as it is for now. So the next thing I want to do is just jump in here and start to add a little bit of flavor to some of these cylinders in there to make it look like lights that are traveling along the inside, and I do that with a material. So go to create redshift material, and then go to my side lights, and then make that material be a tag on that cylinder. Double click the material tag I just created, and let's. This is going to take just a little bit more work. This is probably the least complicated material node setup that I've had in a long time, but it still looks really cool. So let's create a noise node, and then create a ramp node. Drag that in, and so I'm going to duplicate this ramp node by control dragging, and then connect that. The noise node to the input of both of these ramps. Take the top ramp and put that into the input of the overall emission color, and then the bottom ramp will get plugged into the overall opacity color. I'm going to kind of leave that like it is right there. Okay. Let's turn the renderability of some of these other things off. So the volume measure and the middle lights, let's turn all that off. And then let's grab my material node here and go into overall and turn up the emission weight to like, let's do 8. And then with the noise selected, go into remap and then noise general. And for the distortion, let's turn that up to like 1.19, I think I used, and then the distortion scale 1.15. And then under color, for the minimum of the remap, let's start to increase this, and you'll notice that it's starting to sort of make some black areas in here, basically. So you can increase that a little bit. I'll probably take this to like 0.45, I'd say. And then the maximum, if I crush this down, so if I take that down, it actually creates hotter moments. It's a little bit hard to see right now, but it creates a little bit hotter moments, so a little bit more white areas. And then I use this ramp here to colorize that noise. So let's load a preset. I'll choose any of these just to kind of see what it does. Let's use this one. And maybe bring the hotness of that noise down. So you can see here that I'm getting a little bit of purple, a little bit of blue, a little bit of green. But I ended up using on this this flame, which gives you a little, you know what I have to do? I got to go into the base properties and turn the diffuse weight down and the reflection down a little bit on that. So so now you can see that we have these moments of sort of looks like fire a little bit, but it gives that illusion of lights that are traveling through the inside. And then I have this other ramp in here attached to the opacity. So if I crush this down a bit, it would make that geometry be even more opaque. So I like to build things in such a way that gives me more control down the line, even though it may not look like it's doing a whole lot right now. So I think that is good for the setup for this. And then let's go into my middle lights here, and let's copy that tag and drag it onto the cylinder of the middle lights, and then turn the renderability of those on. So now we have the light feeling across all of those. One thing that you will notice is that I'm getting the same texture across all of the clones that I created. So the middle lights and the side lights, it all looks the same. Double click that tag and go into the shader graph. And you can even see in the preview down here that it has like this illusion of like lights, and it's semi-transparent. So that's looking really good. Go into the noise, and under coordinates, change that from object position to vertex attribute. And as soon as I do that, now every one of my clones has a different texture on it. So it's a lot more random than it was before. And then the next thing I want to do is light the splines on the inside in here, and that is really easy to do with redshift. So I will take these middle splines, and with that electric spline selected, Shift-C, and add a redshift object tag to that. And I will go into the curve and turn on the hair strands visibility. And let's make sure that it is rendering. I'll turn these off as well. So now you can see that I am currently rendering those splines as pieces of hair. So let's create a new redshift. I'll do incandescent material on this one. So now that each one of those strands is glowing, essentially, or will also add to the illusion of like kind of that deformation of the glass on the inside. Let's take the spline down in thickness a little bit. So like 0.5 is probably pretty good. And then I will just drag that redshift object tag onto the electric of the middle splines here. And then instead of using that same material, what if I use the material that I had on those middle lights? And so now it gives this illusion of kind of these nice bright splines, like electricity sort of flowing through it. So it's all an illusion. And again, this is just for a style frame. So it doesn't move, but I don't have to figure that out because I'm just making something that looks good. So I'll let the animators figure that out. So this is sort of the base foundation of everything so far. So again, I'm giving you the tools to continue to grow and build on, even though you could just change a few things around. So there's a lot of options on this, and I spent a lot of time developing this. So the next thing that I want to do, and final thing in Cinema, is to add some of these sort of helix that are wrapping around the DNA. So I will do that by creating a helix, and instead of using Shift-C, let's just go into the splines and grab a helix. And let's grab the side lights and duplicate that and call this side helix. And just because I want to stay true to myself, call this side helix a new layer, and then drag and drop that. So now we have a side helix that we're going to use. Delete that cylinder, and then drag that helix to be a child of that cloner. Let's turn the visibility of that plane off so that I can see what I'm doing here. And then go into another viewport. And I will turn this off just to show you what I'm doing. Grab that cloner with the helix underneath it and just drag it towards the tip of one side. Doesn't really matter too much. And then let's increase the height of that to about 2,500, so it's about the same height as our DNA. turn the twist and the bend back on, and go back into my render view. And of course, if you remember, let's render these as splines again. So let's go to tags, redshift, object. For the mode, turn that on to hair strands, and then let's go into the object again. Take the start radius down to like 125 and the end radius down to like 125. And then the end angle, let's just decrease that. So kind of giving the illusion of movement over the DNA. And then kind of to further that point is that the next shot in this particular moment was a sound wave. So we're sort of alluding to the idea of a sound wave in this shot, which will then, this DNA will actually turn into a sound wave in the next one. So it's all just sort of like hinting at the next moment in time. So I will render these out as separate passes, but I'm not going to show you exactly how I broke everything out. However, I will do a really quick example on some of my render settings, which for the renderer, choose redshift. Go to advanced mode and then click on the redshift tab here. Go to globals, increase the reflection, refraction, and combine to 16. And just through some experience with a lot of glassy materials recently, I learned that these settings were some of the best to be using. And then go into sampling, and under unified sampling, automatic sampling, take the samples minimum to like 16 and the max to like 512. So that's the overall scene sampling, so that everything will have that samples in it. But I probably want to increase the samples specifically for the reflections and refractions. And so instead of increasing the samples for the entire scene, let's do an override here and increase that to, I don't know, let's say like 2048. I worked on something recently where I was at like 8K for samples, and the render itself was like 8K. I mean, it was like insane. But these settings that I used right here cut my time in half, whereas if I had increased the samples here to like 8K, it would have taken forever. All right, so that is the foundation of how I created the DNA. So now let's take all of these render passes and go make them look really good. So let's go into After Effects. So here is sort of that final setup that we're going to be creating. So I will create this from scratch. So let's grab that backplate that I had used. So under the assets that I have this backplate, which again is the same emissive backplate that was lighting the glass. And then I will hit Control Y. And I'm just going to label this just for my own sake. And let's take that down to 75%. So I'm just darkening the background a little bit. There's a few ways to do this. That is how I did it. Grab the DNA main, and that is our render. So I did a little bit more work on it. So I have, a few more of those cloners in there. I played with the lights a little bit more electricity. Even have some of these finer cloners in there. So everything that I showed you in Cinema, you could now recreate this. So I just went a little bit further down the line on it. And so I also broke these out into some different passes. So I actually did a render pass, which I was only using the lights on the inside. So I'm going to use that to add it back on top of the DNA itself. So add that back on top, and if I toggle it, you can see it just does a little bit, not a lot. If I solo that out, though, let's add a levels to it. And let's crush this down a touch so that I'm only getting most of the highlights. However, you notice that as I crush it down, I'm only getting these really dark red colors. So let's add a hue saturation just to desaturate it a touch. Take that down a little bit. And then I want to add a glow to this. So I normally would just use glow that's built in, but I've been using Red Giant quite a bit lately, and that stuff is really cool. And I like optical glow a lot. And I will turn the amount up to 75, so it's a little bit brighter. And then for the uniform size, make that 16 and the Y be 32. So I'm making it a bit more anamorphic there, and let's unsolo that. And then for the vibrance, I could increase this if I wanted to, which maybe you do, depends on the moment. I'll leave it like that right now. So it just kind of brightens things up, adds a little bit more color to it. So this is already starting to take shape. The next thing I want to do is grab that Helix that I had just created right before I got out of Cinema. Let's put that on add mode and take the opacity down to like 25%, something like that. So in the process of making this, my client was like, hey, we like those splines, but we want to add a little bit of detail to it just to make it look a little bit more like data. So instead of going back into Cinema to like add cloners and kind of redo that whole thing, I was like, well, let me just get the idea across and then we can go back to it to see if you actually like it. So one thing that I use to get that across really quickly is just use trapcode form. So I will create a new solid. So hit Control Y on a PC, and let's call this Helix form, just so I know what I'm doing. And let's type in form, trapcode, red giant trapcode form on effects and presets. And then under the base form, let's make that, for the base form size, do XYZ individual, and the base form X is 1920 and Y is 1080. So we were actually just making that the size of the comp that we're working in. Take the particles in Z down to 1 and the particles in X. Let's increase that to 640. And I know you think I'm going to say 480, but I'm not. I'm going to say 400. And let's go to my particle and take the sphere feather down to 0. Size random goes up to 100%. Opacity random goes up to 100%. Go down to layer maps here. And under color and alpha for the layer, choose our Helix layer that we rendered out. And then do functionality is lightness to alpha. So and I'll explain this in just a moment. So map over X, Y. So what I'm doing with trapcode form is basically saying that anywhere that this line is, so that is where the white is, to put dots on that or put form on that. So you maybe would notice, but basically I rendered that spline or that helix out on black. So it uses the black and white to emit the particles specifically on those lines. So because I added a little bit of differentiation across here, we just have like these little nice moments of the cloner. It kind of looks like some particles, some data. So again, if the client really likes it and they want it in 3D, I can go back, but this is kind of the idea that I wanted to sell to them. So with the, I used optical glow on the lights, and I want to grab that and actually just copy that and add it to the Helix form. And it's going to get really bright, but I'll put that on add and go down to that effect and take the amount down to like 25%. And then maybe decrease the vibrance a little bit, just a touch. And then for our particles themselves in form, make the color be slightly orange, just to kind of take it into the world that we're working in. And then a lot of times, just to make it not feel too digital, I guess, maybe a little bit more organic, I like to increase the color random. So that will make the lights be a little bit more random. And if you were, I don't know, making something for the holidays, you could increase that to 100%. I'll add just a little bit of color to it, so it just gives a little bit more of a natural feeling in there. So that is kind of the base setup that we're going to start to work from. I also have 2 more Helix layers that I rendered out. I'll put both of those on add, so you can see that I have 2 that now wrap around that a little bit more. So I'm just adding a little bit more detail along that cloner. So again, I showed you how to do the Helix really big, but you could wrap it really tight, and then it gets around that DNA. So it's really just adding some more layers to it just to get the idea across. So the next thing that I want to start to do is add some highlights and just kind of like start to fill this frame out. So let's create a new solid. Control Y, and I will call this highlight right. And I will add a fill to this. Drag and drop. Let's make that like a kind of like a pink, really light fuchsia color. Create just a really quick garbage mat along the side over here. Feather that out ton. Put it on add mode, and then take the transparency of it like way down. So I'm just kind of creating this illusion that there's something happening off screen. So instead of it just being kind of this flat on view, I have just the illusion that something is starting to happen off screen. So let's do that for the left side. So I'm going to call this highlight left. Very easy. And then add a fill. And you might be asking, why don't I just make the solid that color that I want it to be? But I want to do a fill because maybe blue works better, but maybe green works better. So it just gives me the flexibility to kind of try out some different colors really, really quickly versus having to change the actual solid color. So I'm going to make this kind of a light blue, and again, just make kind of a quick garbage mat over here. It doesn't have to be too perfect. Feather that out a ton. Even change it up so that it goes up a little bit higher, something like that. And then take the opacity way down. So now I've got a little bit of blue on the left and a little bit of a pink or warmer color on the right. So I'm just kind of creating a little bit of movement to go across this entire thing. All right, the next thing I want to do is start to add a few more layers in here. So when I'm working with style frames, I don't always create everything from scratch. I like to maybe use reference images and throw those in there. So again, it's just creating the look for the client. It's not solving problems for them because I'm the one who creates the problems for them. So I create the style frames, they solve the problem. So let's add this layer in here called VFX. So I created this a while back. It may have even been found imagery. I kind of can't remember, but I liked it, and it worked in this moment. So this is a pre-made asset. I could probably remake this, but it would take too much time, so I'm not going to do that. So let's just kind of place it on top here. So again, this moment is that moment when the DNA is like, hey, there's a virus, blow up, eradicate the virus. So this is that energy burst moment. So I will add a levels to this. And let's brighten it up a touch, just a little bit. And then a lot of times in these moments, I like to use the mesh warp. And then for the mesh warp, I'll make the columns and rows both be like 3, take the quality up. So now we can just kind of like bend this thing into shape. You know, so it's like this moment where everything is kind of bursting off of it. So just kind of get that into shape. Doesn't have to be too perfect. Maybe it overlaps just a little bit. Totally fine. It's up to you, whatever you feel like doing. And maybe I'll even duplicate this again and take that mesh warp and just kind of adjust it a little bit more, add a little bit more depth in there. Maybe I'll even take some of this off so it's not so hot on that side. So I just create, so I hit Q, G to create a, use my mask tool. And I created a mask, and then on that layer, I realized I haven't said this yet because I'm just working very quickly. Hit M, and now I'm in my mask, and click subtract, and then feather that out. So now I'm kind of subtracting that moment out, or that highlight out of that little piece right there. And then another thing I could do is kind of like colorize this a little bit. So again, one of the really quick and easy ways to do this is just to use that optical glow that I've used on some of my other layers. Let's put it on that base one and copy and paste it so it makes everything a little too bright. So let's take the amount down to like 4, something like that. I can also colorize it with this, which is really cool. Make it even more red or whatever it wants to be, up to you. Maybe I'll just make it a little bit more blue, something like that. So that feels really good. So let's add a few more layers to this to kind of give it that moment of explosion. So I have a few other little elements here that I'll add. And again, I'm just kind of showing you how I do this. It's not exactly how I did it, because originally I did this in like 4 days, and I'm trying to get this done in about 1 hour right now. So let's create a little garbage mat. So hit G, and I'm just going to kind of draw this moment out. So when I saw this image, it sort of just felt like this energy burst that was kind of moving out, which it is. And I'm going to add this back on top, put it in add mode, and then crush the levels down just a touch, just so that I'm not seeing so much of it. Crush that down. Kind of move that into place, so it doesn't have to be exact, but it's just this moment in time, right? This burst of energy outwards. I have another one that is a burst of particles, and again, create a little garbage mat. Just kind of select some of these, add a levels to it, crush it down, put this on add mode, and then we can rotate this around just like a little bit. So again, it's just kind of this moment where the energy is bursting out. We have a few little layers going on here. might take the opacity of this down. So, I spent a lot more time just kind of like crafting this. But this is sort of the general setup that I used. So with those 4 things I just created, let's colorize their layers. Let's put them on a different color layer. Create a new null object. Grab those 4 layers that I just created for that energy burst and pick whip them to that null. And let's make that null be the same color. And then grab the null itself. So now everything is attached to that null. Duplicate it first. So I'm going to duplicate everything. So Control D to duplicate it and colorize them something else because you guys know I like everything on its own layer. And then rotate that around. So now I'm just kind of creating the other side over here. And it doesn't have to be exact, but it gets the idea across that this is kind of bursting outwards. And then I could even go in here to my mesh warp and just kind of manipulate this a little bit so that it's not the same, that it feels a little bit different than the one on top, and it's not too symmetrical. But something like that, I think, will probably work. So the next thing that I want to do is use magic bullet looks, because if we take a look at the scene, my colors are kind of all over the place. I've got, kind of a muted blue color, bright blue color. I've got oranges, purples. I've got, different colors inside here. So sometimes I am so engaged in the act of building that I forget to manipulate the color as I'm going. So one of the things that I like to do with that is use Magic Bullet Looks by Red Giant because it's amazing. So go to Layer, create a new adjustment layer, and under my effects and presets, type in Looks, and I will also call that layer Looks, and go into Edit. Let it load up. So at this point, I have a lot of presets at my disposal. So if the client comes along and is like, we have this reference, we don't exactly know what the color should be, I use Magic Bullet Looks to just kind of go in and see what some of these presets for it will do. Blockbuster is kind of cool. It's got a variety of different effects in there. But you can see what's happening is it's quickly changing all of the color in there to kind of make it feel a bit more cohesive. Sometimes if I want to get weird, I might go down here to Synth and choose some of these other extreme color options. I do it sometimes, but rarely. But what I ended up going with on this particular version was this one called Iced Wing. And if you wanted to search for a specific one, you could just type that in down there. So that's one that I used. So I thought that what this did for me was bring it into the same color world. So I'll turn that back on. So it's got a bit, it's gotten a bit muted, right? So now I have to make a few adjustments. And I could do that inside Looks. Looks is super powerful. But, excuse me. But I know that all I really want to do for this is add a little bit more blue to it. So I created a new adjustment layer, and I will use color balance. So I'm just going to bring a little bit of blue back into this. So I'll go into shadow blue balance and increase that just to bring a little bit more blue in there, which I think looks good. The next thing I want to do is add a little bit of a vignette around there, and let's label this color balance. And let's create a new, like a little bit of a vignette, just so that we're sort of focused in the middle here and we don't really see a whole lot on the edge. So let's do Control Y to create a new solid. Call that Vignette. And then I am just going to kind of quickly draw a mask around here. Nothing too crazy. Put that on multiply, though you don't really need to. Hit M, so that'll bring up the mask, and put that on subtract. And feather that out quite a bit, and then hit M twice, and that's going to bring up all of the settings in that mask. And let's take the mask expansion and take that out a little bit. So now if I toggle this on and off, you can see I just added a little bit of mood on the outside there. I got a little bit of time left, so I want to quickly show you how I added a bit more particle information in here. So I'm going to start to hustle a little bit because I don't have a ton of time. So Control Y, I will call this side, let's call this right side lights. All right, So let's go into my effects, type in form, and use red giant trapcode form. Let it load up really quickly. And underneath my base form, I'll just leave it as it is right now, even though I probably should spend a little bit more time kind of crafting this for you guys. I'm just going to rotate this around a little bit and increase the height of Y a little bit as well. Just kind of bring this over. For the particle itself, sphere feather, I always take that down to 0, size random, 100, opacity random, 100. And then I just want to distort this with a fractal field a little bit. And so for the displacement of that, let's increase that. So this displacement is happening because of a fractal field. For the F scale, let's make that be like 3. So I wanted it to feel as though it were still cohesive and not too displaced. And so now it just feels like these big moments, like these big particles. And then I will create a like a mat for that. So let's create like a quick garbage mat around here. Let's feather that out a little bit. And for the track mat, let's put that on alpha mat. And again, feather that out. So now I just have like this hint of particles on this side. And I'm going to duplicate this really quick because I feel compelled to show this to you guys in a pretty solid state before I leave here today. Just drag this over, grab that mat on top, and bring that over to the side, something like that. Maybe I rotate this around just a touch. So again, just have kind of the hint of particles on both sides. And now I just want to create like a really quick depth mat. So let's do Control Y, create a black one. Control Y, make a white one. And create a big mask over the entire thing. Something like that. And feather this out. And group that together. Call it depth. Create a new adjustment layer. I'm working really quickly now. I think I went too slowly early on. And I'm just going to use camera lens blur on this. So you can see that we have this overall blurred. Make sure that you choose that depth mat that I originally created and invert it. Maybe make this a little bit more extreme, something like that. I always like to take the aspect ratio to like 0.5. I also use frish lift a lot, which is like super cool. And then one final touch, I got 2 final touches and that's it. And then I'm done. It's going to take like 30 seconds. Bring that lights layer that was just those highlights, bring that back on top. So we're kind of bringing the orange back in. And then my final touch, the final thing that I will do for you today is add a little bit of grain back on top. And I do that by using the Re-Noiser by Magic Bullet. And I don't know if you can see this, but I'm going to zoom in really close, toggle that on and off. And the grain amount, let's increase that to like 50. And the size, take that down to like 25. Turn on Monochrome Grain. And if I toggle that on and off, you can see that it adds a little bit of grain, which just kind of ties everything back together. That is my final frame. Thank you. So what I ended up going over with you today, I'm going to choose the right one really quickly here. What I went over today with you is using cloner objects and volume measure to generate the base DNA strand. I created the interior of the DNA with spline, cylinders, and cloner objects, and then I used those redshift materials to create the illusion of lights and electricity. I exported those images, just kind of showed you the settings for that. I imported everything into After Effects. I used red giant trapcode form to create the additional details on that DNA. And then I used red giant plugins to create the overall look and the glows. And then I used magic bullet looks to get quick color ideas for style frames. So once again, my name is Bryan Coleman. I'm a design director based out of Denver, Colorado. My website is bryancoleman.com. On Instagram, I have Bryan_the_Coleman. Twitter is Bryan the Coleman. Some of my NFT work is bryancoleman.nft.xyz. And I am on Foundation Marketplace at Bryan Coleman. That's it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Great job, brother. The internet didn't actually have any questions. You were thorough. They were just like, nope, they got it. So
good.
You put in the work.
I was hauling.
You ready? Questions from the live audience. Any questions live that we have? Everybody's killing it this day one. Like everybody's executing.
If you do have questions, I'll be over on the back side over here. I mean, I know that I spoke to a few of you, so
yeah. Bryan will be there for the next hour, so you have him there if you have any questions. But stay tuned. We have our next presenter up, Arturo Wong. So hang tight. We're going to be getting him started, and we'll get rolling. Until then, we will see you in the next 5 minutes. Thanks again.